and he had asked to be kept alive as long as possible. And during the time he was in coma, I was thinking of the Dylan Thomas villanelle that says, "Do not go gentle," because he wasn't going gentle. He was saying, "Keep me alive at all costs." So all the time I was thinking, for God's sake, please go gentle, stop raging.
Welcome to The Glimpse. I'm your host, Hannah Lowe. Mimi Khalvati has published 10 collections, including The Meanest Flower, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and Child, New and Selected Poems. She founded the Poetry School and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Mimi received the King's Gold Medal for Poetry in 2023. Her collected poems won the inaugural Jalak Prize for Poetry. Mimi Khalvati is our guest today on The Glimpse. Mimi Khalvati's poems are precise, luminous and formally assured, emerging from a vast and sustained body of work that continues to evolve and surprise. Her writing is marked by a deep engagement with form, ghazals, sonnets, sequences, yet never feels constrained by it. Instead, she uses structure as a way of thinking, testing and opening the poem out. There is a contemplative clarity to her work, a way of holding memory, exile and the natural world in delicate balance. Mimi's poems feel both intimate and expansive, attentive to fleeting moments while opening onto larger questions of time, displacement and belonging. These are poems of quiet intensity, where craft and feeling are inseparable and where each line seems carefully tuned to its emotional and musical register. I'm so glad to have her here on The Glimpse with us. Mimi, welcome.
Thank you, Hannah. Lovely to be here.
I don't think I ever asked you about what it was like to receive the King's Gold Medal for poetry.
Well, it was an absolute complete surprise. I mean, I'd never even thought about it. So I remember Simon Armitage telephoned me and he started talking about this rather secret council they have, and that they're the people who sort of judge it and decide who the medal will be awarded to. And all the time he was talking quite a lot about this council, I was thinking, oh my God, he's going to ask me to join the council. And how can I find an excuse to avoid it at my grand old age, you know? So when he actually said, and we've decided to give it to you, I practically fell off my chair. So it was wonderful, of course, really lovely, to have that kind of acknowledgement.
And then was it followed with a formal ceremony, presumably?
Well, yes, unfortunately, I missed it because we were supposed to go to the palace to meet the king and be awarded the medal in person. But just before that, I'd had my heart attack, which is brought on by adrenaline. And I thought, oh my God, if I go to the palace, that is certainly an occasion where I might have a rush of adrenaline. So I better avoid it, So sadly, I had to pull out.
The excitement of meeting the king.
Well, yeah, and the sheer terror, actually, I'd be really, and, that worry, the stress of what you're going to wear.
I know.
And, what would you say? So anyway, I missed out on that.
I was so delighted that you won that medal and the acknowledgement for your poetry, which is, there's a long, long history of publishing amazing collections, each one so different. And of course, I've known you for a long time. We first met at the Poetry School in London many years ago when I was definitely a sort of fledgling poet, although I think it was a sort of advanced course that somehow I managed to get into. And it really changed my life, Mimi, because you suggested that I started to look at fixed poetic forms. And I think that was the match below my work, really. So
set you alight.
It set me alight.
Well, even then, and I have to honestly say, and I'm not just saying this to flatter you or anything, but you really were even then a shining star, and you stood out. You did. I thought, wow, here's somebody like a real poet, in the making, and I think pushing you towards that. is because actually very few people have that particular bent or talent or even interest to be able to develop their work in fixed forms or, even in metrical verse and so on. And I could see you were up for it. And I think because also you're really good at the piano, aren't you? So you've put in, all those hours and hours and hours of piano practice and all those arpeggios and things. It's quite similar. And so I knew it's in your temperament and experience,
If we could see behind you, we'd see your piano as well. And I know we've talked before about what the sort of tenacity of learning to play an instrument, like how that is a similar thing to being able or willing, up for, as you say, working with poetic form. It's labour intensive.
It does really take a lot of practice, more than people realise, I think,
Yeah, and when they realise, they're often put off it, I think.
Well, absolutely, especially now, I think, when everything moves so much faster and one spends less time on anything, on the whole, I would say. Things are done very quickly. But it takes patience, yes.
And in some way, I think those sorts of poetic forms are an antidote to modern life. They're a way of stepping out of the fast lane if you have the temperament, as you say, for it. Well, you're going to read us a poem that's written in form from your own work. So looking forward to hearing you read.
Okay, well, this is an early poem of mine. It was just in my second collection, and it's a villanelle, so it's a fixed form, and it is metrical with a lot of substitutions of the metrical feet, but it's not rhymed as, a very classic villanelle would be, and it's called Coma. Mr. Khalvati, larger than life he was, too large to die, so they wired him up on a bed. Small as a soul he is on the mountain ledge. Lid's gone thin as a babe's. If it's mist he sees, it's no mist he knows by name. Can you hear me, Mr. Khalvati? Larger than life he was, and the death he dies, large as the hands that once drowned mine, and the salt of his laugh in the wave. Small as the soul he is on the mountain ledge. Can you squeeze my hand? Oh, where are the hands I held so tight to pull me back to the bays? Mr. Khalvati? Larger than life he was, with his outstretched hands that squeeze thin air. Wired he is, tired he is, and there, small as a soul he is on the mountain ledge. No nudging him out of the nest, no one to help him fall or fly. There's no coming back to the bays. Mr. Khalvati? Larger than life he was, small as a soul he is on the mountain ledge.
Thank you, Mimi. It's a poem that's about your father, and it's interesting that in your reading you pronounce your own surname as Khalvati, which is, I'm guessing, the Persian pronunciation.
That's right, and I'm so glad actually you picked up on that, because I've had all my life a very problematic relationship with my own name. Coming to England as a very young child, I learnt my surname with an English accent. So it was always Khalvati. So it was Mimi Khalvati at assembly at school, So I grew up inhabiting this name that was Khalvati. I didn't know it had a meaning. I didn't know how to pronounce it. And of course, there were no Iranians around who I would hear pronouncing it properly in Farsi. So as I got older, I can't remember at what age, maybe not until I was about 13 or something, I realised, oh my God, I'm actually mispronouncing my own name. And it's supposed to be pronounced Khalvati. And then later, I discovered that it means a Khalvati in Farsi is what you call a Sufi retreat. And it comes from the adjective khalvat, meaning quiet. So it's like a place of quiet retreat, or that Sufis would use, which I thought was a brilliant name for a poet.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Obviously, I'm not a Sufi. Yeah.
And that idea of quietness is interesting in the poem. Even in how you read it, you have to find the right repeating refrains. So in this poem, Mr. Khalvati, larger than life he was, which you even read louder than the next refrain line, small as a soul he is on the mountain ledge. So the idea of this very, I got the feeling of a loud, buoyant man being very much reduced by his hospitalisation and becoming small, quieter, small as a soul he is on a mountain ledge. So that was a deliberate choice, presumably, to find those contrasting refrains.
Well, you're absolutely right, Hannah. Thank you. I don't think it was conscious. I didn't sort of consciously think, oh, I'll go from big to small. I mean, that's just how it happened. Thinking of him as he was in life. He was a very, big brown bear of a man, I would say, laughed a lot and raged a lot, actually, and raved, as in the Dylan Thomas Villanelle. He did a lot of raging and raving. But he was also very, very, very warm and very exuberant and had that kind of personality. And then, of course, seeing him in the hospital, which somehow the hospital bed suggested to me this mountain ledge, I suppose partly because of the whiteness as well of the sheets and so on. And he did look very reduced.
And then there's this beautiful, the part of the poem that's in parentheses, if I'm pronouncing that right, where are the hands I held to pull, in mine, to pull me back to the bays? And I think that's your voice, but it could be your father's voice. There's some ambiguity there. And I was wondering about the use of the word baize that I know as the fabric that covers snooker tables or pool tables.
Exactly.
Of course, I know about baize because my dad, one of his many entrepreneurial moments, which is the best way I could put it, made a lot of snooker tables in our back garden. He had a job.
Really?
Yes, I think they were probably fixed, as in bent, as in had extra pockets or secret bits. I mean, I don't know. But we had rolls of baize in our kitchen for some months.
Oh my God, really?
So I knew that name.
That's so right, because I actually worried about this word because I knew that people wouldn't necessarily understand it. And as I said, this is an early poem, so that sort of problem I didn't solve. I like to think that in later years I might have solved it somehow. But my dad, like yours actually, loved gambling.
Well, that's why I know the word.
Yes, so he was always at the card table with the bays. And I realised after I'd written this poem, well, in fact, during the time he was in this coma, 6 months he was in a coma, it was horrific.
Wow.
And they kept him alive with all these machines. And he had asked to be kept alive as long as possible. And during the time he was in coma, I was thinking of the Dylan Thomas Villanelle that says, "Do not go gentle." Because he wasn't going gentle. He was saying, keep me alive at all costs. And then later they sent him home, so his wife had to look after him in a coma in their flat. It was horrific.
Yeah.
So all the time I was thinking, for God's sake, please go gentle, stop raging. Do you know what I mean? This literally, the words of the poem, the Dylan Thomas poem, were going through my head when I visited him in America in the hospital. And then much later, I wrote the poem and realised retrospectively that's how it came out and why it came out as a villanelle. But I hadn't, consciously made the connection when I wrote it.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting how subconsciously it had worked on you, so that even, as you say, retrospectively, you look back at your own poem and think, I do see the connections more than I perhaps originally realised. And the line that really moves me in this poem is the salt of his laugh in the wave, which is a sort of collection of words. It's so interesting, the grammatical construction, the salt of his laugh in the wave. And yet it brought to mind this beautiful image of you as a child playing with your father in the sea. And then I actually wondered how true that was, given your disconnection from your family and Iran.
That's a very interesting question. My father had very little presence in my life, actually, because I left him and Iran when I was 6. I saw him once, I think, during the years I was growing up, when I was 13, when I went on the only holiday back to Iran and met him like a stranger. Oh, this is your father type of thing.
Yeah, wow.
And interestingly, that time, and I hadn't thought of this, but your question has made me think this. That time that I first met him, we went on holiday to the Caspian Sea. And I didn't really get to know him because the grown-ups would be spending the whole time gambling, these card tables. I mean, literally all through the night. And me and then my half-sisters and brother, we would be, of course, on the beach with the waves and so on.
Maybe hearing your father laugh, even though he actually wasn't in the water with you, he was probably sleeping off a night of rummy. And the hands in the poem seem to be important. They come back a few times. Large is the hands that once drowned mine. And then again, where are the hands? So it made me think that the image of the hands seems important in terms of your, at least your imaginary around your father.
His hands and feet I remember very distinctly, partly because my hands are exactly replica of his. In fact, I tend to look a bit like my father in drag. If he had a long silver wig, he'd look just like me. Well, which is a bit sort of disconcerting.
Well, lucky him, Mimi.
But he had these very broad hands, broad fingers, and they were dry and warm. And I remember the feel of them, either my hands in his or just his hand on the shoulder. You'd feel the warmth, something very comforting.
Yeah, the hands felt reassuring.
Yes, exactly.
Even if the man wasn't. And of course, I have to ask you about the form.
Mm-hmm.
I know in my own work, form has allowed me to revisit the past. Sometimes I felt it's enabled for me to put a bit of a shine on things that weren't necessarily that shiny when it came to my family and my father. And I wondered why you chose this form for this poem.
Well, this is the first villanelle I ever wrote. And given that it's in my second collection, I remember quite clearly my first collection was, like most people, a hodgepodge of everything I'd been writing at that time. I hadn't a clue, actually, what I was doing. So it was a bit of this and a bit of that and so on. This second book, called Mirror Work, I decided I hadn't got a clue what I was doing in free verse. So I was going to focus on that. So it's quite unusual that this poem is in the form of a villanelle in a book which is so predominantly in free verse. But it is actually a free verse villanelle because it isn't rhymed, though it is sort of metrical. And it was interesting to me, again retrospectively, that because of the Dylan Thomas villanelle going through my mind when I was in America in the hospital, I literally would be like a mantra saying it to myself because there was no one to whom I could express my upsetness and disapproval, really, and unhappiness that he was being kept alive like this and that he wanted to be kept alive. And I think then just completely unconsciously or instinctively, when I wrote this poem, it became a villanelle.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, that seems like a good place to take a break now. We're going to come back after the break and hear you read the Dylan Thomas poem, Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night, and then we'll talk about it some. So see you after the break.
Thank you.
We hope you're enjoying this season of The Glimpse. It's just one small part of the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation.
We're the founders, Peter
And Kathy Halstead. Our goal is to make great poetry more accessible to everyone, and we do that in a variety of ways, through partnerships, our film series, this podcast, and our website, brinkerhoffpoetry.org.
We hope these works will lure you into a parallel universe, the way a Mobius strip brings you into another dimension without leaving the page you're on.
Thank you so much for listening.
Welcome back to The Glimpse. I'm joined today by Mimi Khalvati. Mimi's going to read now the Dylan Thomas poem that she's chosen as her inspiration.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Thank you, Mimi. We've already talked about the relationship of your villanelle Coma to this poem, and I'd already noticed reading it earlier, that line there on the sad height, which seems to me to be the jumping off point of your poem. And we were talking before the break about the way these refrain lines in the villanelle are so important. And these lines of Dylan Thomas, they seem to have, I wonder if you agree, a sort of epigrammatical quality, as in they sound like things that have been being said forever.
Yes, he has that quality. And of course, when you hear him read the poem as well, it's so kind of, it's like an oracle speaketh forth kind of thing.
Yes.
I think the whole poem is an absolute masterpiece in rhetoric, and not in a negative sense, but in the art of persuasion, because the whole thing is structured as an argument. It starts off as the imperative, doesn't it? Do not go gentle, and rage, rage. But then, interestingly, all the subsequent verses go into the indicative tense, and they're presented as examples to prove his argument that, well, this kind of men, they don't, and that kind of men, they don't, and the other kind of men, in a sort of crescendo, as it were, of increasing intensity and drama, I would say. But what's weird is actually the indicative tense is disguised, I think, by these initial capitals. So very often you hear people read all the refrain lines as though they were imperative, whereas in fact it's only in the first and last verse that the imperative tense is used.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But I'm interested in your thoughts about the wild men in that fourth stanza. They caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. What's your reading of those?
It's interesting, isn't it? I relate that one very much to Dylan Thomas himself, who you could say was a wild man. I mean, very tragically, another sort of connection is that he also died in a drunken coma, didn't he?
I read all about it today. I mean, he died so young. He was 39.
I mean, and so young, exactly. And I think in a way he himself was a wild man. And in his verse, he did actually catch and sing the sun in flight. I mean, half the time you didn't know actually what he was talking about, but it sounded always gorgeous, didn't it?
Amazing. Yeah.
And then too late, they realise, oh my God, life is short. I've wasted half the time getting drunk or whatever. I mean, that's my interpretation on a very prosaic level of it.
Yeah, I was reading today about his death and actually what he was just in such a mess physically when he went on this tour of New York. And a doctor, he had a sort of doctor friend, I think, who was coming round to the hotel room, finding him in these sort of terrible states, still drinking, and injecting him with cortisone, I believe, and then finally with morphine, which is what put him into a coma. But he was still, the whole time, he was still wild. He was still going out, he was drinking, he was womanising, he was doing poetry readings.
Absolutely.
So maybe it is about himself. And then in that fifth stanza, grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay.
I find this is a very tragic one, and I also relate this very much to my own father, because Dylan's father, we assume he knew he was dying at this point, though the weird thing is that he wrote this poem 5 years before his father actually died.
Yeah, I read that.
But he had throat cancer, and my father also had throat cancer, which is why he, was in hospital. And he also was losing his sight. Right. So I think the grave men near death who see with blinding sight, I think is almost like portrayal of, having maybe thought about himself as one of the wild men and then thinking about his father as one of the grave men near death who are seeing, losing their eyesight, that even if you're blind, you still can have happiness or fulfillment or even some kind of illumination in your life or excitement.
It's so interesting because the common reading of this poem is that it doesn't, there's a kind of turn in the last stanza when he brings his father in by addressing him, and you, my father, there on the sad height. But I think you're right, it's foreshadowed by the stanza before that.
I think it is foreshadowed all along in a way. And I think for me, how I feel this poem, rather than maybe interpret it, is that it starts off almost standing on a height, almost like a podium, with this very strong imperative like Moses, the Ten Commandments, with this edict, this is, don't go gentle, stay alive at all costs kind of thing. But by the end of it, although it's foreshadowed, it's the first time that, of course, he addresses the father, because this poem is triangulating, isn't it, between the speaker, who is saying, do not go gentle, the addressee, who might be just the reader or the general, or the world or the public, and then the third addressee is suddenly my father, as the personal address there. And at that point, Hannah, the most interesting thing in this whole poem for me is this curse, comma, bless, comma. I mean, what is that? It's not, I'm logically thinking, first curse me, now bless me. I think he's losing the plot. I think, I do, really. It's like, I knew my father. There, curse, bless, or do whatever you like with me, leave me whatever, but for God's sake. And then this word, I pray, do not go gentle. I think it just says, please don't die.
Yeah. I think that's what the most interesting line.
Do you know what I mean? I think it just collapses into a sort of sobbing prayer.
Yeah, and it's different. It looks different.
Totally different tone.
Yeah, it looks different on the page. The syntax is different. The punctuation is different. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. It's very different tonally, or like the attitude or the emotional force in this poem is quite different from yours. There's overlap.
Very.
But there's a strong difference as well. There was a sort of entreaty, a feeling on your part that your father should be allowed to die.
Yes.
And here it's really the opposite.
Exactly. It was almost my trying to say to somebody, nobody there to hear, look, it's hopeless. Why inflict all this suffering possibly on him, but also on his poor wife who looked after him for months.
So difficult.
By herself in the apartment with all this machinery and everything.
Yeah.
And I don't think she ever really recovered.
Yeah, but that level of care and responsibility. And it's interesting, isn't it, in a way that, thinking about the Thomas poem, how we talked about Dylan Thomas himself perhaps being a wild man, but how he it was not a feeling that I got from his biography about him really wanting himself to stay alive. There's a sort of level of self-destruction.
Do you think there was a self-destructive urge in him?
I mean...
Where he lived recklessly.
He lived recklessly. And, yeah. And do you think, going back to the technique in the poem, unlike your Villanelle, you talked about how you came to that form and the kind of the looseness of the form being unrhymed. But here, the poem is metrical. The rhymes are perfect. I think the rhyme, it lends this stateliness, which I think maybe is why people are able to sort of miss the more tentative argument in the poem. I think the rhyme slightly hides it.
I think that you're right, that is missed. And they're not only full rhymes, but they're all long vowels. I, A. And it makes it very, very memorizable. It's very quotable. People always say, do not go gentle into that good night. I remember the first thing I actually noticed when I first came across this poem is that word gentle, and it's not an adverb. And I thought it was really quite interesting, do not go gentle.
As opposed to gently.
I don't know. Yeah, is that Welsh or is that just poetic? I don't know what it is. But anyway, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
There was that wonderful description. Do you remember Theodore de Banville, who was, I think, an early exponent of the Villanelle? But I always remember this, and I remember this gorgeous quote and description, and I think it's so perfectly exemplified by the Dylan Thomas poem. He said that the Villanelle is a plait of gold and silver threads into which is woven a third rose-coloured thread, which is the middle line. And of course the refrain lines, one is stronger than the other. So the A refrain is the gold. It's unyielding. It's the strongest metallic, fixed sort of substance. Then the second refrain line is the silver thread, still metallic, still unyielding, but softer. And which is like the fixed poles of birth and death. And then in between is this very vulnerable, very fluid, very flexible third rose-coloured thread, which is the mortal life, weaving between the two. like I always think of that image of the slalom, between those fixed poles. Isn't that beautiful?
It's so beautiful.
I love that.
It's such a perfect way of describing this most amazing form. And I want to say thank you, Mimi, for discussing this with me today, because I think I've seen things in this poem that I hadn't noticed before by having to, with some of these very famous poems, you accept their fame and you maybe accept the sort of dominant reading or the way you've heard them be read. But today is an opportunity for me to, look much more closely. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's always a joy to listen to you, to talk with you and to experience you.
And to experience you. Now, the question I've been asking everyone at the end of these episodes is, what are you working on now, Mimi? But I feel like you maybe aren't writing poetry, but you're doing other sort of creative things. Or are you writing poetry and you haven't told me?
I'm not writing poetry. I am actually reading a lot. I mean, I read a lot for my work of mentoring and so on, but I'm also looking at a lot of art books and going to galleries and things like that. I feel like I've been visually a bit starved. So I'm feeding that sense, really.
Oh, that's wonderful. And maybe next time I see you, we could go to see some art together. That would be nice.
I'd love that. That would be brilliant.
Mimi Khalvati, thanks for joining me on The Glimpse.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a complete pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Hannah Lowe. Mimi's poem Coma is from Collected Poems, published in 2024 by Carcanet and used with their permission. Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night was written by Dylan Thomas, copyright the Dylan Thomas Trust, and used with their permission. Coming up next week, Richard Scott talks about the benefits of channeling queer ancestors and the power of crystals in his life and writing. Make sure to subscribe to The Glimpse wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find episodes on our website, brinkerhoffpoetry.org/podcast. We'd also love to hear from you. Drop us an email at theglimpsepoetrypodcast@gmail.com. The Glimpse is a production of the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation. I'm your host, Hannah Lowe. Our senior producer is Jennifer Wolfe. Kat Yor is our technical director and mixing engineer. Editorial director Amanda Glassman is our curator and production coordinator. Amy Holmes is the Foundation's executive director. And our co-founders are Kathy and Peter Halstead. Thanks for listening.